Welcome to my channel. Today I will talk about atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During World War II, American bombing raids on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki, August 9, 1945, that marked the first use of atomic weapons in war. Tens of thousands were killed in the initial explosions and many more would later succumb to radiation poisoning. On August 10th, one day after the bombing of Nagasaki, the Japanese government issued a statement agreeing to accept the Allied surrender terms that had been dictated in the Potsdam Declaration. The turning point in the quest for atomic energy came in January 1939, 8 months before the start of World War II. German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, following a clue provided by Irène Joliot-Curie and Pavle Savich in France, 1938, proved definitely that the bombardment of uranium with neutrons produced radioisotopes of barium, lanthanum, and other elements from the middle of the periodic table. The significance of this discovery was communicated by Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch, two Jewish scientists who had fled Germany, to Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. Bohr had been preparing to journey to the United States, and he arrived in New York on January 16, 1939. He discussed the matter with Albert Einstein, John Archibald Wheeler, and others before announcing to the world on January 26 the discovery of a process that Meitner and Frisch had termed fission. Enrico Fermi proposed to Bohr that neutrons might be released during the fission process, thus raising the possibility of a sustained nuclear chain reaction. These revolutionary suggestions triggered a flurry of activity in the world of physics. Subsequent studies by Bohr and Wheeler indicated that fission did not occur in uranium-238, the isotope of uranium most commonly found in nature, but that fission could take place in uranium-235. Gradually, many of the riddles surrounding fission were resolved, and by June 1940, the basic facts concerning the release of atomic energy were known throughout the scientific world. While engaged in one war in Europe and another in the Pacific, the United States would launch the largest scientific effort undertaken to that time. It would involve 37 installations throughout the country, more than a dozen university laboratories, and 100,000 people, including the Nobel Prize-winning physicists Arthur Holly Compton, Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, Ernest Lawrence, and Harold Urey. The first contact between the scientific community and the U.S. government regarding atomic research was made by George B. Pegram of Columbia University. Pegram arranged a conference between Fermi and officers of the U.S. Navy in March 1939. In July, Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner conferred with Einstein, and the three later went to New York to meet with National Recovery Administration economist Alexander Sachs. Supported by a letter from Einstein, Sachs approached Press Franklin D. Roosevelt and explained the significance of nuclear fission to him. Roosevelt formed the Advisory Committee on Uranium, appointing Lyman Briggs, director of the National Bureau of Standards, to serve as its chair. In February 1940, a fund of $6,000 was made available to begin research. By the time of its completion, the project's budget would exceed $2 billion US. Officials were now well aware of Adolf Hitler's atomic ambitions. In his letter to Roosevelt, Einstein explicitly called attention to uranium reserves in Czechoslovakia that had fallen under the control of the Third Reich in March 1939. The British had also begun studying fission, and Urey and Pegram visited the United Kingdom to see what was being done there. By August 1943, a combined policy committee had been established with the United Kingdom and Canada. Later that year, a number of scientists of those countries moved to the United States to join the project that by then was well underway. On December 6, 1941, one day before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the project was placed under the direction of Vannevar Bush and the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD. Bush's staff included Harvard University Press, James B. Conant, Pegram, Urey, and Lawrence, among others. Alongside this scientific body was created the Top Policy Group, consisting of Bush, Conant, Roosevelt, U.S., Vice Pres, Henry Wallace, U.S., Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, because there was no way of knowing in advance what technique would succeed in creating a functional bomb. It was decided to work simultaneously on several methods of isolating uranium-235 while also researching reactor development. The goal was twofold: to learn more about the chain reaction for bomb design and to develop a method of producing a new element, plutonium, which was expected to be fissile and could be isolated from uranium chemically. Lawrence and his team developed an electromagnetic separation process at the University of California, Berkeley, while Urey's group at Columbia University experimented with the conversion of uranium into a gaseous compound that was then permitted to diffuse through porous barriers. Both of these processes, particularly the diffusion method, required large complex facilities and huge amounts of electric power to produce even small amounts of separated uranium-235. On June 18, 1942, The War Department assigned management of construction work related to the project to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Manhattan District. Much early atomic research, most notably Urey's group, was based at Manhattan's Columbia University. On September 17, 1942, Brig. Gen. Leslie R. Groves was placed in charge of all Army activities relating to the project. Manhattan Project became the code name applied to this body of atomic research that would extend across the country. The first experimental reactor, a graphite cube about 8 feet, 4 meters on edge and containing about 7 tons of uranium oxide, had been set up at Columbia University in July 1941. By the end of that year, reactor work had been transferred to the University of Chicago, where Arthur Holly Compton and his cryptically named Metallurgical Laboratory were considering related problems. On December 2, 1942, the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction was carried out under Fermi's supervision in Chicago Pile No. 1. A reactor that Fermi had constructed in a squash court under the bleachers of Stagg Field, the university's football stadium. It had now been proven that the controlled release of atomic energy was feasible for the production of power and the manufacture of plutonium. In February 1943, construction began on a pilot uranium enrichment plant located on the Clinch River in the Tennessee Valley, about 15 miles, about 24 kilometers west of Knoxville, Tennessee. The Clinton Engineer Works, later known as Oak Ridge, occupied a 70-square-mile, 180-square-kilometers dirt tract of land and came to employ roughly 5,000 technicians and maintenance personnel. For the project's full-size reactors, however, a more isolated site would be necessary. Groves had expressed concern about the pilot reactor's proximity to Knoxville, and the larger reactors would have significantly greater power needs than could be accommodated in the Tennessee Valley. In January 1943, Groves had selected a 580-square-mile, 1,500-square-kilometers tract in south-central Washington for the project's plutonium production facilities. The location was desirable for its relative isolation and for the availability, in large quantities, of cooling water from the Columbia River and electric power from the Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Dam hydroelectric installations. The creation of what came to be known as the Hanford Engineer Works required a significant displacement of the local population. Residents of the towns of Hanford, Richland, and White Bluffs were given just 90 days to vacate their homes, and the Wanapum Native American people were forced to relocate to Priest Rapids, losing access to their traditional fishing grounds on the Columbia. At its peak in the summer of 1944, the huge complex at Hanford employed more than 50,000 people. For the final stages of the project, it was necessary to find a location that was even more remote than Hanford for the purposes of both security and safety. A site was chosen by the Manhattan Project's scientific director, J. Robert Oppenheimer, on an isolated mesa at Los Alamos, New Mexico, 34 miles 55 kilometers north of Santa Fe. Beginning in April 1943, scientists and engineers began arriving at the Los Alamos Laboratory, as it was then called. Under Oppenheimer's direction, this team was tasked with developing methods of reducing the fissionable products of the Clinton and Hanford production plants to pure metal and fabricating that metal into the components of a deliverable weapon. The weapon had to be small enough that it could be dropped from a plane and simple enough that it could be fused to detonate at the proper moment in the air above the target. Most of these issues had to be addressed before any significant stores of fissionable material had been produced, so that the first adequate amounts could be used in a functional bomb. At its peak in 1945, more than 5,000 scientists, engineers, technicians, their families lived at the Los Alamos site. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, and within 24 hours Harry S. Truman had been briefed about the atomic bomb program by Stimson. Germany surrendered in May 1945, thus ending the war in Europe. But combat raged on in the Pacific. The bomb development teams at Los Alamos had settled on two possible designs. One, fueled by uranium-235, would utilize a gun assembly that used high explosives to shoot two subcritical slugs of fissionable material together in a hollow tube. The violent collision of the two slugs would cause the uranium-235 to reach critical mass, thus triggering a chain reaction and explosion. Engineers were confident that this comparatively simple design would work, but a sufficient quantity of uranium-235 would not be available until about August 1, 1945. The Hanford site would be able to deliver enough plutonium-239 for testing by early July, but Los Alamos scientists had determined that the gun assembly model would not be compatible with plutonium as a fuel source. An alternative design had been proposed, one that would use concentric layers of high explosives to implode the fissionable material under enormous pressures into a denser mass that would immediately achieve criticality. It was believed that this implosion design would be the most efficient way to weaponize the meager amount of plutonium that had been produced thus far. For the test, Oppenheimer selected a location on the Alamogordo bombing range, now White Sands Missile Range, 120 miles, 193 kilometers south of Albuquerque, New Mexico. He called the site Trinity in reference to one of John Donne's holy sonnets. The first atomic bomb, a plutonium implosion device called Gadget, was raised to the top of a 100-foot, 30-meter steel tower that was designated Zero. The area at the base of the tower was marked as Ground Zero, a term that would pass into common parlance to describe the center of an often catastrophic event. Military officials and scientists occupied observation posts at distances ranging from 10,000 to 17,000 yards, 9 to 15 km. On the morning of the test, the skies were dark and it was raining, with occasional lightning. Gadget was detonated at 5:29:45 a.m. on July 16, 1945. The explosion caused a flash that illuminated the mountain peaks 10 miles, 16 kilometers away. Soon there followed a tremendous sustained roar accompanied by a tornado-like burst of wind. Where the tower had stood, there was a great surging ball of fire, followed by a mushroom cloud that rose some 40,000 feet, 12,200 meters into the sky. The heat of the explosion had completely vaporized the tower. In its place was a saucer-shaped crater about a half mile, 800 meters in diameter and 25 feet, almost 8 meters deep. The floor of the crater was fused into a glassy jade-colored mineral subsequently dubbed trinitite. The bomb had generated an explosive power equivalent to approximately 21,000 tons of trinitrotoluene, TNT. The blast was visible from a distance of 50 miles, 80 kilo, and it shattered windows 125 miles, 200 kilometers away. Residents of Gallup, New Mexico, more than 180 miles, 290 kilometers from Ground Zero, reported feeling the ground shake. In an attempt to head off questions about the world-changing event that had occurred at Trinity, the Army issued a brief statement to the press. A remotely located ammunition magazine containing a considerable amount of high explosives and pyrotechnics exploded. But there was no loss of life or limb to anyone. News of the successful test reached Truman, who was attending the final meeting of the Big Three Allied powers at Potsdam, Germany. Truman informed Soviet leader Joseph Stalin that the United States possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. On July 26, the Big Three issued an ultimatum, calling on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. When it became clear that no surrender was imminent, plans to use the bomb went into effect. Some within the Manhattan Project had argued for a demonstration explosion on an uninhabited site in the Pacific. This was considered but soon discarded, largely because of concerns that the demonstration bomb might not prompt sufficient reaction from the Japanese government. By this time, several dozen B-29 bombers had been modified to carry the weapons, and a staging base at Tinian, in the Mariana Islands, 1,500 miles, 2,400 kilometers south of Japan, had been expanded into the largest airfield in the world. On July 16th, just hours after the successful completion of the Trinity test, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis left port at San Francisco with the gun assembly mechanism, roughly half of the U.S. supply of uranium-235, and several Los Alamos technicians. The remainder of the U.S. uranium-235 stockpile was flown to Tinian on transport planes. Upon the arrival of the Indianapolis at Tinian on July 26th, assembly began on the bomb, dubbed Little Boy. The Indianapolis departed Tinian after the delivery, but it was sunk en route to the Philippines by the Japanese submarine I-58 on July 30th. Hundreds of crew members who survived the torpedo attack died in the water while awaiting a rescue. The components of a second bomb, a plutonium device nicknamed Fat Man, were transported to Tinian by air. By August 2, 1945, both bombs had arrived at Tinian, NUS. Commanders were waiting only for a break in the weather to order the execution of Special Bombing Mission 13, an atomic attack on the Japanese home islands. The pilots, mechanics, and crews of the 509th Composite Group of the 20th Air Force had all trained, with the specially modified B-29s that would serve as delivery vehicles for the bombs. Paul W. Tibbets, Jr., the commander of the 509th, would pilot the B-29 that would drop the first bomb. His 11-man crew included Madge, Thomas Farabee as bombardier and Manhattan Project Ordnance expert Capt. William Deke Parsons as weaponeer. Tibbets personally selected plane number 82 for the mission. And shortly before taking off at approximately 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, Tibbets asked a maintenance worker to paint his mother's name, Enola Gay, on the nose of the aircraft. Two other B-29s accompanied the Enola Gay to serve as observation and camera planes. Once the Enola Gay was airborne, Parsons added the final components to Little Boy. This was done because a number of the modified B-29s had crashed on takeoff, and there was some concern that a crash would cause a fully assembled bomb to detonate. Wiping out the installation at Tinian, the skies were clear, and the Enola Gay encountered no opposition while approaching the target. At 7:15 a.m. Tinian time, Parsons armed the weapon, and the Enola Gay ascended to an attack altitude of 31,000 feet, 9,450 meters. A trio of B-29s had flown ahead of the strike force to perform weather reconnaissance over the primary, Hiroshima, and secondary, Kokura and Nagasaki targets. The pilot of the Hiroshima mission radioed Tibbets that there was little cloud cover and that he should proceed to the primary target. Just after 8 a.m. local time, 9 a.m. Tinian time, the crew of the Enola Gay sighted Hiroshima. At around 8:12 a.m., Tibbets relinquished control of the aircraft to Farabee, who began his bombing run. It took roughly 45 seconds for Little Boy to descend to an altitude of 1,900 feet, 580 meters, at which point it exploded in the sky directly above Shima Hospital. Within a fraction of a second of the detonation, the temperature at ground level exceeded 7,000 degrees C, 12,600 degrees N, and a powerful blast wave scoured the landscape. Out of a population of 343,000 inhabitants, some 70,000 people were killed instantly. And by the end of the year, the death toll had surpassed 100,000. Two-thirds of the city area was destroyed. Nuclear shadows were all that remained of people who had been subjected to the intense thermal radiation. A massive mushroom cloud rose to a height of more than 40,000 feet, more than 12 kilometers. Although less than 2% of the uranium-235 contained in Little Boy had achieved fission, the bomb was horrifying in its destructive power. The explosive yield was the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. Aside, Bob Caron, the Enola Gay's tail gunner and the only member of the crew to directly observe the blast, described the scene as a peep into hell. A series of shockwaves rocked the Enola Gay as it departed the area. And at a distance of nearly 400 miles, 640 kilometers, the mushroom cloud was still visible. Upon returning to Tinian, after a flight of just over 12 hours, Tibbets was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. News of Hiroshima's destruction was only slowly understood, and some Japanese officials argued that their own stalled atomic program had demonstrated how difficult it would be to create such a weapon. It was possible, they argued, that the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was the only one in the American arsenal. Other members of the Japanese government had been arguing for months in favor of a negotiated settlement, perhaps mediated by the Soviets. The bombing of Nagasaki. By the morning of August 9, 1945, Soviet troops had invaded Manchuria and Sakhalin Island, but there was still no word from the Japanese government regarding surrender. At 3:47 a.m., the B-29 Boxcar took off from Tinian. The aircraft was piloted by Marge Charles Sweeney, with Capt. Kermit Behan serving as bombardier and Manhattan Project veteran Commodore Frederick Ashworth in the role of weaponeer. Their payload was Fat Man, the plutonium-fueled implosion device similar to the bomb detonated at the Trinity test. Unlike Little Boy, Fat Man was fully assembled when it was loaded onto Boxcar, and shortly after takeoff, Ashworth armed the device. As with the Hiroshima bombing, the strike plane was preceded by other B-29s performing weather reconnaissance, and light haze but relatively clear skies were reported over the primary target of Kokura. At about 9:45 a.m. local time, Boxcar reached Kokura, but by then visibility had degraded badly. 3 attempted bombing passes failed to yield a clear view of the target, the city's massive arsenal. Roughly 45 minutes passed as Boxcar lingered over Kokura, and concerns about diminishing fuel reserves and Japanese anti-aircraft defenses led Ashworth to conclude that they would have to proceed to the secondary target. Sweeney turned the plane south toward Nagasaki. Geographically, Nagasaki was not an ideal target, whereas Hiroshima was flat and the bombardier's aim point was a visually distinctive feature near the city center. The urban area of Nagasaki was divided into 2 coastal valleys separated by a range of hills. This site was located between the 2 densely populated valleys. But the uneven terrain would reduce the destructive potential of a weapon that was significantly more powerful than the bomb that had been dropped on Hiroshima. Shortly before 11 a.m. local time, Boxcar arrived at Nagasaki only to find the city shrouded in thicker clouds than Kokura had been. By this point, the aircraft was running so low on fuel that Sweeney notified the crew that they would only be able to make a single pass over the city. A gap in the clouds appeared far north of the intended aim point, and Behan released the bomb. The bomb descended to an altitude of 1,650 feet, 500 meters, and, at 11:02 am, exploded over the Urakami Valley, northwest of the city center. Fat Man detonated with the explosive force of 21,000 tons of TNT. An estimated 40,000 people were killed instantly, and at least 30,000 more would succumb to their injuries and radiation poisoning by the end of the year. An exact accounting of the death toll would prove impossible, as many records were destroyed by the bomb. About 40% of the city's buildings were completely destroyed or severely damaged, but a significant part of Nagasaki, particularly in the southeastern industrial and government district, was relatively unscathed. Boxcar was jolted by the first of a series of shockwaves as it flew away, and observation planes captured photographs of the mushroom cloud as it rose tens of thousands of feet into the air. Unable to return to Tinian because of his increasingly desperate fuel situation, Sweeney guided Boxcar toward Okinawa, where he brought the aircraft in for an emergency landing. Truman's decision to use the bomb would be a source of discussion and controversy for decades. But the effect of Nagasaki was almost immediate. An abortive coup by senior Japanese military leaders failed, and on August 14th, the Japanese government accepted the Allied terms. The following day, Japanese broadcaster Nippon Hoso Kyokai (NHK) aired a recorded address from Hirohito in which he announced Japan's surrender. For most of the Japanese public, it was the first time they had heard the emperor's voice. World War II formally ended on September 2nd, 1945, with the signing of surrender documents on the deck of the USS Missouri. Shortly after the conclusion of hostilities, Manhattan Project physicist Philip Morrison traveled to Hiroshima at the request of the War Department to study the effects of the atomic bomb, characterizing the bomb as preeminently a weapon of saturation. He said, "It destroys so quickly and so completely such a large area that defense is hopeless." The bomb destroyed 26 of the 33 modern firefighting stations in Hiroshima, killing or severely injuring 3/4 of the firefighting personnel. Of 298 registered physicians, only 30 escaped injury and were able to care for survivors. More than 1,800 of the city's 2,400 nurses and orderlies were killed or seriously injured. Every hospital except one was destroyed or badly damaged. Electric power plants, railroads, telephones, and telegraph lines were all out of commission. Horrified by what he had witnessed, Morrison would spend the rest of his life campaigning against nuclear weapons and a potential third bomb. On June 30, 1946, the U.S. Department of War made public the results of the official investigation of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It had been compiled by the engineers and scientists of the Manhattan Project, who had access to data assembled by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, the British Mission to Japan, and the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. This report stated that Hiroshima suffered 135,000 casualties, or more than half of its population. The greatest number of these occurred immediately after the bombing. Nagasaki, a city of 195,000, suffered 64,000 casualties. Attempts to quantify the death and suffering at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessarily estimates at best, and this earliest effort omitted significant population groups. Most notable among these were Korean forced laborers, thousands of whom were present in both cities. The report stated that the effects of the atomic bombs on human beings were of three main types. 1. Burns, including flash burns caused by radiation. 2. Mechanical injuries resulting from flying debris, falling buildings, and blast effects. And 3. Radiation injuries caused entirely by gamma rays and neutrons emitted at the instant of explosion. Burns caused about 60% of the deaths in Hiroshima and about 80% in Nagasaki. Falling debris and flying glass caused 30% of the deaths in Hiroshima and 14% in Nagasaki. Radiation caused 10% of the deaths in Hiroshima and 6% in Nagasaki. No harmful amount of persistent radioactivity was found in either of the two cities in the months after the bombings. For all the death and destruction that they caused, the bombs seem to have provided an unlikely guarantee to Japan's territorial integrity. Documents unveiled after the collapse of the Soviet Union revealed that Stalin had been prepared to occupy and potentially annex Hokkaido in the 2 weeks between Hirohito's address and the formal Japanese surrender. Having already been promised the Kuril Islands under the terms of the Yalta Agreements, February 1945, Stalin saw an opportunity to claim the northernmost of Japan's home islands and effectively turn the Sea of Okhotsk into a Soviet lake. Pressure from Truman and the implied threat of the atomic bomb caused Stalin to call off the scheduled invasion just days before it was to take place. Hokkaido would be spared the fate of North Korea in the post-war years. The surviving victims of the bombings, known in Japan as hibakusha, were promised free medical care for life by the Japanese government. In 1947, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, since 1975 the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, RAF, began to conduct medical and biological research on the effects of radiation. More than 120,000 hibakusha enrolled in the RAF's lifespan study, a massive project that investigated the health effects of exposure to atomic bomb radiation. The immense size of the cohort and the open-ended nature of the data collection period made the project an invaluable resource for those studying the long-term effects of radiation exposure. So friends, how did you like our video today? Tell us in the comments.